thank you for joining us again. This is our fourth and final session in trying to understand what the modern state system is and the challenges really that we face today. And this, in some ways, this session is the most uncomfortable one for me because it's starting to get into sort of very, very recent things and current events, and even into trying to say, okay, well, so what are the things that we're going to be seeing as challenges in the future? Actually, if we can wait just 1 second, we have our last compatriot here.
Okay.
Welcome.
Sorry.
Good. So let's go ahead and take a look, and we'll do a quick recap on what we've done so far, and then get into what we're doing today. I do have to give a warning, actually, even before we get going. We're going to do some things in what might feel a little bit out of order. So I think we're going to get to all of the different topics that I want to, but we are going to jump back and forth a little bit in terms of time. So a recap, we said in 1648, the 30 Years' War ends, and the European countries, basically everybody except for England, and England will join in, practically speaking, pretty soon after, basically sit down to figure out how do we stop that from ever happening again. And so they sign this Peace of Westphalia that basically says all states are sovereign, right? They get to determine what happens in their territory. And when we want to relate to someone in terms of force, we deal with the state, right? So the state has this monopoly on force. All you little nobles in various places, you don't get private armies anymore. The rulers no longer own these states. They're now their own sort of independent entities, at least in theory. The problem is the states still want to gain power. And if you can't go to war over religion and then turn that into a political war, you got to find a new reason to go to war. So sometimes it's you're cutting me off from this resource. Sometimes it's you are denying the deals that we had made, or you're denying my state my rights. And sometimes, and we're going to see this more and more, it's you are sort of violating the rights of a legitimate government. And so, for example, when France gets involved in the American Revolution, right, the excuse is, well, we recognize, I'm speaking as France here, we recognize this new country, the United States of America. This isn't an internal British war anymore. This is a war between two states. And so, of course, we can get involved and help one or the other. And that, we're going to see, that sort of attitude continues certainly even, or especially into the period we're going to be talking about today. That's all well and good, except then you have the French Revolution, and then you have Napoleon, and Napoleon conquers much of Europe. And again, there are devastating battles of hundreds of thousands of soldiers on each side. And Europe says, well, let's never do that again. And so they sign the Congress of Vienna to create a balance of powers that will hopefully keep anyone from fighting a major, major war again. Okay, great. So they sign this balance of powers, and that falls apart within about 15 years as some of the new states fall apart, as the Ottomans continue to fall apart, and the result is that you end up with World War I. And at the end of World War I, the various states, trying to again say, let's not do that again, come up with this idea of the League of Nations, and it has no real teeth. There is no real way to enforce its rules. And so then after World War II, they create this thing called the United Nations, run by the big allied powers, right, which we said last time were officially called the United Nations. And the idea was to try and prevent any giant war from happening again. So that's what we're up to right now. So we're going to start, having talked about the United Nations, we're going to start discussing with the United Nations. We know the Cold War is going on in the background, and we're going to specifically address the Cold War as well. But I want to kind of explore a little bit this issue with the United Nations and the ways in which that sort of falls apart, or at least its power of enforcement is going to fall apart very early as well. In 1951, there's a resolution that's passed, UN Resolution 82, which calls for North Korea to withdraw from South Korea. It has invaded South Korea. And it calls on member states to render assistance to the UN in executing this. And we said last time, sort of very famously, the USSR is boycotting the Security Council at this point. They're in protest basically of the fact that China's seat on the Security Council belongs to the Republic of China in Taiwan, which is run at this point by Chiang Kai-shek, who had been sort of the de facto ruler of China when the UN was established. And the People's Republic of China, mainland China, has no seat. So the Soviets are out protesting, and this resolution passes with 9 supporting, 1 abstaining, and 1 absent. A few months later, North Korea has not withdrawn, and another resolution is passed. This time, again, the Soviet Union is absent. And while the vote is not quite as lopsided, I should mention, by the way, the Security Council is not at its full size yet at this point, right? In other words, they haven't rotated on the full complement of rotating temporary members, which eventually ends up being a total of 10, right? There are 15 total today. But so that resolution passes as well. Now, a lot of times that's sort of framed as, okay, so the US gets permission to go in, and it's totally legal, and it sort of gets dropped there, and people sort of recognize, okay, well, yes, the Soviet Union abstained, and they realize, well, maybe we shouldn't be abstaining anymore from these. And that's sort of, people sort of nod and go along with it. But there are actually big consequences to that, which is that as these get passed through, without the Soviet Union's sort of real consent, that idea of sort of everybody, or the big powers, vetoing each other really comes into fruition. Now, up until this point, the great powers haven't, I mean, it's only 6 years since the end of World War II, it's not so long. But initially, the great powers aren't vetoing each other, right? They're abstaining if they don't agree with a particular action that's being taken. And this is where sort of that vetoing process starts, right? Because the Soviet Union does say, we don't want that to happen again. And all of the other powers then sort of acknowledge, well, then we're going to use our vetoes too. And actually, in terms of consequences that we don't often think about, this results in a new resolution that the General Assembly basically gets to, if there's a big enough divergence in the number of votes, that the UN General Assembly can sort of actually override a veto. Not fully, right? It can't mandate force the way that the Security Council can, but it can sort of override a veto, and actually most famously and recently, this is invoked 10 times over the course of the next 60, almost 70 years. But it's invoked 10 times. The last time it's invoked is involving Palestinian issues, and that invocation technically has lasted for decades. There's the other ones, for example, the condemnation of Britain and France being involved in the Suez Crisis in 1956 doesn't come from the Security Council, because Britain and France are on it, and veto that resolution. This is used to condemn them from when they go in and to basically say, well, we're going to send in a UN peacekeeping force to try and stop the hostilities here. Most recently, like I said, there's been this Palestinian resolution under this article, or under this resolution, that's been open for decades. So when the UN a couple of years ago sort of recognized Palestine as a state, right, or at least granted it a number of those features, that was done through the auspices of this resolution, right, where the Security Council was not going to approve it, and so the General Assembly had enough, a divergent enough number of votes that they gave Palestine, right, a certain number of rights towards a Palestine or a Palestinian entity, moving towards a Palestinian state. So that sort of veto aspect is important, and it is the dominant thing in terms of the use of force from the UN. But actually, in using it, the General Assembly has occasionally taken matters into their own hands. In theory, Westphalia would say that's good, right? And in theory, the founding of the UN says that's good, right? Let's get everyone in to discuss and to make decisions. But of course, there are states who aren't so happy with that sort of thing going on. And the result, ultimately, both of these rampant vetoes that pick up and of this sort of General Assembly piece is that the UN often has not been effective in sort of fulfilling its mandate. So I just want to touch on 5 examples of that. One is Rwanda, right? Very famously, there had been a UN peacekeeping force in Rwanda. It was understaffed. The Security Council actually passes a resolution to reduce the staffing levels even. And then, of course, we know that there's a genocide that goes on in Rwanda in the early 1990s. This isn't really an example of the vetoing issue. This is an example of where the UN was not able to get itself together quickly enough, or where the member states sort of didn't buy in enough to that idea of, okay, the UN says things are bad, let's push that, right? Let's push through some resolutions. Let's actually send soldiers. Let's fix this thing. And of course, again, there's a genocide there. If you think about Westphalia, the UN is in theory the only body that can really deal with this, because this is breaking that sovereignty of states. Right? Remember, states after Westphalia can do what they want in their countries, and after the Holocaust and World War II, there's this feeling of, well, maybe we're not so comfortable with that. But they don't really want to say, right, the big powers don't want to say, oh yeah, you can just jump in whenever you want, because that leads back to pre-Westphalia, right? That leads back to, I'm going to invade your country for any reason, right, with any excuse. And so in theory, the UN is supposed to be the body that sort of, by the consensus of lots of states, overrides that sovereignty. And they fail to do so here. So if that's one of the goals, or if that's one of the hopes for the UN, that the UN can find a way to prevent those sorts of massacres and genocide and things going on internally, then maybe it's not so effective, and maybe it doesn't solve that piece of the problem coming out of World War II. The Gulf War, this is the original Gulf War, right, the one in 1991, actually you could argue is both an example of the UN working and an example of it failing. It's an example of the UN working because over the course of a dozen or so resolutions, the Security Council ramps up pressure on Iraq, and finally sort of allows states to go in and handle the matters that are going on, especially after the invasion of Kuwait. There are no vetoes, and so in theory, at least, all of this is on the up and up. The problem is that even though you have this massive worldwide coalition, right, with the US and the Soviet Union really for the only time both intervening on the same side, the actual force isn't really organized by the UN, right? It's really organized by the US and then the Soviet Union, with the UN agreeing to it, but not really with a full UN backing, right? The UN doesn't say, oh, there should be a force and America should command it. It sort of leaves things open enough that the force is created and America does command it. And so again, on the one hand, Iraq is forced out of Kuwait, and on the other hand, the UN doesn't really set things up for success. Very famously, the massacre in Srebrenica, it also occurs under UN auspices, and is another example of that sort of failure, where the UN, again, sort of is so slow in responding that it's not able to be successful. In Kosovo, on the other hand, the UN does respond quickly enough, except, of course, again, in Kosovo, it's not really that the UN says we should have a force that goes in and fixes these things. It's really that the various countries around are willing to sort of agree that NATO can handle what's going on there, right? And that ultimately Slobodan Milosevic should basically assent to what NATO has done. And so again, we keep getting this sort of, the UN is occasionally backing an action that seems to keep the peace, or that seems to keep states from interfering with one another, that seems to keep these genocides sometimes from getting out of hand. And on the other hand, it sort of does so very slowly and tends to cede its power, because the use of force really still all comes from states, right? They don't really give up that power mostly to the UN. They give up a little bit of it, but mostly, right, the UN has some teeth, as it were, but not a lot. And then, of course, in 2003, with the Iraq War, the UN again sort of passes a resolution originally that sort of maybe permits force if Iraq will not agree to inspectors, does not pass a second resolution, which the US sort of wanted, that was going to explicitly give permission for force, but which did not have even the 9 votes necessary in the Security Council, let alone China and Russia had threatened to veto such a resolution. And so again, it's an example of sort of the UN being somewhat effective, but not actually solving the problem.
How did you find that they were effective? I only hear negative.
Right, so exactly. In other words, if part of the idea is that they permit one country to interfere with another, or there's sort of a forum for saying, yes, an invasion is permissible under certain circumstances, then yeah, they do that from time to time. But it's always very much in vague terms, and it's always very much balancing all of the diplomatic acts. And so it's not clear that they are effective. Certainly if the goal is to, now, the flip side is, of course, and this is always the piece, or the question, if the goal is to prevent anything like World War I or World War II, well, we haven't had anything like World War I or World War II. Is that because of the UN? Well, that's another question, and very likely not, right? But it's hard to say, if we're looking for different institutions or different reasons why we haven't had that repetition yet, and hopefully not going forward, then maybe this is one of the reasons, right? Maybe this is one of the causes, that there's some sort of an outlet for at least taking some actions within world auspices. We're going to get to the Cold War in a moment, and of course we're going to see that the UN plays in many ways a very little role there, and of course that big war several times, as you know, does almost come about, and the UN doesn't play any real role there. So we are going to see, it doesn't seem like the UN is the core reason, although there's maybe a reason. So here's our counterpoint, right, which is the Cold War. And of course, the fact that the US and the Soviet Union are continuously at loggerheads, and that we actually end up with what could have been nuclear war multiple times. We all know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's sort of one of the most evident ones. We know now, for example, and we know now actually that nuclear war was more likely then than anyone really at the time even knew. I didn't say anyone, obviously some of the players knew. Some of the actual politicians knew. But for example, there was a Russian submarine with a nuclear torpedo where in order to fire it, they needed the agreement of the top 3 officers on the ship. And 2 out of 3 officers wanted to fire it. And the last one didn't. And so we could have had a war there. And also sort of very famously, Castro pushes for the codes for the Soviet missiles. And one of the Russian officers, one of the Soviet officers, makes a policy completely whole cloth, and basically tells them it's Soviet policy that we don't give codes to our allies. There wasn't a Soviet policy.
Why give them the missiles?
What's that?
Why give them the missiles?
Well, I mean, they're in Cuba.
Yeah, why give them to them if they're not?
Right, well, so exactly. But that this officer was nervous about that Castro might choose to use them without Soviet authorization, right, just to use the codes on his own. And so he sort of makes this rule up. There's another incident which is not as well known. In 1983, where there is a set of Soviet radars that misreads something. There's a software glitch, and they think that the US has launched intercontinental ballistic missiles. And all the radars suggest that they have. And ultimately, the decision-making structure, and this lasts for several minutes. And of course, the flight time we're talking here is like half an hour. So it's not they don't have time to really make a determination. And ultimately, some of the people involved basically make the decision that they think it was a false alarm. But they don't actually have any evidence to that effect. So this whole idea, right, in other words, we know that actually the big war almost did happen multiple times. And the UN doesn't do anything about that.
One or two people have full comfort.
Right, exactly. 1 or 2 people have that power to launch nuclear missiles with no check on them, with no prevention. And so the big war almost did happen. And of course, again, the UN has no real power here, right? It encourages or helps along a little bit the SALT talks, right, and various other arms limitation talks, but it doesn't, certainly is not the big driving force in preventing that conflict. And of course, then we also have proxy wars. Now, proxy wars, you can actually argue to some degree, are a little bit of a safety valve, right? They're designed in order, not designed, I should say, nobody's designing proxy wars, but the way that they worked was to sort of try and prevent that big war. And they did so, again, through that intervention of who do people recognize as legitimate government, right? So why is the US in Vietnam, for example? Well, because it's backing what it claims is the legitimate government. Why are the Soviets in North Vietnam? Well, because they're backing what they claim is the legitimate government. How is it that you don't get the bigger countries going to war? Well, again, if they fight this out through their proxies, right, then they're attempting to gain power and hopefully isolating that big war from happening. We all know about Vietnam because it's very much on the American mind, but of course the Soviet Union has sort of the same thing in Afghanistan, where the US backs various groups against the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union in turn loses large numbers of soldiers, but never is at a point where it's going to directly blame the US. One thing this does bring in, and we're going to touch on this more in just a moment, I do want to give one more example where the proxy war thing almost doesn't prevent war. But one place where actually, one issue this brings up is what's the deal with non-state actors, right? In other words, the Viet Cong are in theory, right, framed as being, they're guerrillas, they're a terrorist group of sorts. Because of course, if they're not, then they're an invading North Korean army, and shouldn't the US and South Korea be invading North Vietnam? And in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen are definitely a non-state actor. They're definitely not seen as American, even though they're getting money and supplies and weapons from the Americans, because if they were American, well then shouldn't the Soviet Union be confronting America? And we see this all over the place, right? We see this all over Latin America, where you have communist groups and you have US-backed groups, you have the Contras, and you have, and all of this is the US and the Soviets sort of engaging these non-state actors. And the interesting thing is that's all basically sort of violating Westphalia in its own way, right? It's all sort of giving the legitimacy of force to a group that isn't a state. Now, in some cases, they want to rule over a state, or they very often want to rule over a state in the long run. But it's sort of it's an interesting sort of violation as a way to get around this worry about the big war, right? There's sort of a breakdown a little bit of Westphalia here. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. There is one proxy war that I do want to bring up, because they don't always fully work. And that's the Yom Kippur War. We don't think of the Yom Kippur War as a proxy war most of the time, in part because Nixon was not terribly fond of Israel, and certainly was not behind Israel's involvement in the Yom Kippur War, right? That's the Arab countries. And the Soviets were not behind the Arab involvement in the Yom Kippur War. Again, that was the Arab countries. But both sides, of course, get into it. Right? America flies a number of weapons into Israel over the course of the first couple of weeks. And then as Israel gains more and more success, there's a real and legitimate worry of what happens if Israel is too successful. In other words, when the war ends, Israel is pretty well within striking distance of both Cairo and Damascus. And the Soviet Union actually threatens to directly get involved if Israel actually takes either of those cities. At which point the US is saying that it might get involved. And so, of course, the result is that the US flies a number of spy planes over the Sinai Peninsula and basically threatens both sides until they back down, because the US very much does not want this to escalate into World War III. But that danger is still there. And I think one of the pieces to that, or one of the important things to note, in Vietnam and Afghanistan, you always have that excuse of non-state actors. You can always disclaim them. Right? It's very easy to sort of disclaim a group that the other side is saying, oh, they're terrorists, and saying, yeah, we don't have anything to do with that, I don't know what you're talking about. It's much harder when both sides, the two sides of a war here, are actual states, are Israel and Syria and Egypt, to say, oh yeah, we don't have anything to do with our actual ally. And so this actually almost ends up in a very messy situation too. So we know that the UN is not terribly effective. We know the Cold War almost ends up in nuclear war a couple of times. And we know that proxy wars sort of serve as an outlet, as a valve, most of the time, to let different sides have conflicts with each other without escalating into that big war that we're really worried about. There, okay. All right. The Cold War ends, at least in theory. All right, the Soviet Union, or I should say the Eastern Bloc falls apart, the Soviet Union collapses, and Francis Fukuyama very famously writes a book called The End of History and the Last Man. And his basic framing is that the world is headed for Western-style liberal democracies everywhere. His actual example, he actually... What's that?
When did
I want to say it was in the 1990s. I don't remember which year. Right? It's sort of pre 9/11, post fall of the Soviet Union. Just like in that idea that okay, Western liberal democracy has triumphed. His actual example is the EU. He's actually thinking more along the lines of the EU, that Western style democracies will sort of get together. And maybe some of those lines of what's a state will blur a little bit. We know, of course, that doesn't happen. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time here devoted to that question of, well, why doesn't that happen? So in terms of why doesn't that happen, or in terms of sort of what is the late 1990s or even like the last 20 years, what's going on, and how is it that we go from, hey, Western-style democracies are triumphing, and this is going to be the end of war and the end of history. So how do we end up with the situation we're in today? So one of those is this issue of terrorism that I brought up before. There was terrorism before, we just talked about it a little bit. A lot of that terrorism was very internal. Or was sort of a, proxy war fought with the goal of taking over countries, right? Of my group is going to dominate that country. It's going to dominate that state. What's behind me is all groups that are listed as terrorist groups by the US, right? Today, many of those groups are Muslim groups, but there are other groups as well, right? We have Al-Qaeda. I've listed FARC up here, right, which is the big militia group. It's very well known in Colombia. They've actually sort of maybe reached towards a peace much more recently in the last couple of years, but it's still listed on there. We have Boko Haram is of course a Muslim group. ETA is the Basque separatist group. The Tamil Tigers are in Sri Lanka. Sorry, I had this put together last night. So Shining Path is also one of these groups, and I'll look up for you afterwards who it is. One of the groups that's not specifically a Muslim group, and I sort of wanted to highlight those. And of course, famously, the one Jewish group that's up there, Hanachai, which of course has sort of been a little bit in the news more recently. And then these are the two remaining sort of offshoots of the IRA, right, of the Irish Republican Army. Because of course the IRA, right, in the Good Friday Accords, gives up violence, and so we don't have the IRA as a terrorist group anymore, but there are offshoots that do still exist, sort of some of those hardcore terrorists who kind of never gave up the game. Many of these groups, some of these groups, like the Tamil Tigers, did fight for essentially taking over a territory. But a lot of these groups didn't, right? A lot of these groups don't really fit into that category. So, for example, what Al-Qaeda's after originally was not really a territory, or not really to control one territory. And in fact, in some ways, they didn't really want to have a state. Because when you have a state, you have to conform. And this is that's actually been a big part of dealing with some of these terrorist groups. Right, after Israel withdrew from Gaza and Gaza sort of fell to Hamas, so I should actually say between that, right, part of the rationale for withdrawing from Gaza was this idea that if Israel withdrew from Gaza, that the various groups in Gaza would sort of have to form state institutions and would be restrained by that. The extent to which that's true is an interesting question. Of course, in the news very recently, right, that Hamas has been sort of maybe trying to reach some sort of a ceasefire because it's facing internal protests over conditions in Gaza. And then, of course, if you saw in the news a few weeks ago, the rockets that were headed towards Tel Aviv, at least according to Israeli intelligence, seem to have been from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, with the goal in part of scrapping any of those sorts of talks. And so there's sort of this interesting question of what happens when a terrorist group becomes a state. In some ways, that's sort of what ISIL's weakness was, ISIL or ISIS, that it, in sort of forming a state, gave itself an address. But we do end up with this question of how do you deal with it when you have terrorist groups that at least make pretenses to not being state-sponsored terrorist groups, that are their own thing. Or even if a state does back them, they do so sort of with plausible deniability. It doesn't feel like there's a way to really threaten that group, because unless you actually catch the members of it, right, they don't have anyone they're responsible for. Right? You can't go and say, well, I'm going to put an embargo on your state, right? We're gonna prevent trade with your state. We're gonna blockade your state. They don't have a state. And that, of course, has been part of our problem, for example, in Afghanistan, right? That Al-Qaeda didn't sit down and try and defend the Taliban state. It sort of allowed the U.S. to come in, and then sort of figures, okay, well, if we stay here long enough and we use enough bombs every so often, that sooner or later the U.S. will leave. And so this is, again, one of those threats to Westphalia, not in a big sense, at least I should say, not in the sense of creating a big war right away, but the question of if you say that wars and conflicts and force was to be used between states, well, they're breaking the rules. And there's no home address to go to, necessarily, at least in many cases, to stop them from doing so. Okay, so I want to touch a little bit on international relations, which is also the texts that are in front of you. The two big sort of schools of international relations, especially post-Cold War, have been neoliberalism and neo-realism. Neoliberalism is sort of that operating, the thing that operated when we talk about that idea of the end of history. Right? Neoliberalism is the idea that states can potentially work together for common goals, and that international institutions help that to happen. right? So for example, when China is brought into the World Bank and the IMF in the 1990s, the idea is that if you bring China into international institutions, that will sort of keep them in line with everyone else, right? That exclusion is actually dangerous. That was one of the failings of the League of Nations, and that when you exclude someone, you basically give them no incentive to cooperate. And in fact, give them an incentive to sort of buck the authority of the world powers, as it were, or some world powers more. And so you want people to participate in the IMF, in the World Bank. You want countries to feel like they should be donating to UNICEF, and so on. You want countries to link themselves together into things like the EU, where there's a body that they sort of work through, even if they retain their own independence. The problem is that the extent to which this is true has sort of been called into question. Right? In other words, China did sort of fall into line, but if the hope was that China was also going to move towards Western-style democracy, well, that certainly hasn't happened. And if the hope was that the EU would push sort of Western-style liberalism, well, there's a lot of countries in Europe where you have far-right parties that have gained power, right? Where, okay, great, so Hungary is now a Western country, it's now independent, it's the late 1980s, it's, that's great, that's wonderful, they joined the EU, and now, of course, you've got Orban in charge, and he's sort of the far-rightist who's not quite as far-right as some of the other parties that people were even more worried about. And so the question of, well, can you really fully bring people into line through the uses of these institutions is something that's to some degree come into question. It's certainly still an idea. It's certainly still something that, for example, President Obama tried to push. But it is a question, and certainly it was a predominant theory in the 1990s, right? That whole idea of using NATO in Kosovo was in part that that NATO sort of brought everyone into this conflict together in order to sort of better the world, and in order to sort of keep NATO together at least. But whether it really is fully true or not is an interesting question. The other school, and it's one that in particular we're going to see in their own ways President Obama and President Trump both buy into, is this idea of Neo-Realism. The idea that states really are kind of in it for themselves, or kind of have their own interests, and that they're really trying to gain for themselves. And they're not trying to gain they're trying to gain relative power, not absolute power. Now, I actually want to use as a case study. This is an excerpt from a book. It's called The Israel Lobby. It is terribly, terribly anti-Israel in a lot of ways. It was condemned even by a number of people like Noam Chomsky, who, of course, has not traditionally been a great friend of Israel. But I actually want to use it because it does a great job of explaining neo-realism in a certain way. Walt and Mearsheimer, the two authors of this book, have a terribly hard time understanding why the US is backing Israel. And so they come up with this idea of the Israel lobby. And that's because, both of them being neo-realists, it doesn't seem like US backing for Israel fits into their model. Right, so they say the lobby's influence helped lead the US into a disastrous war in Iraq. This book is published in 2006, so we're talking about the more recent Iraq war. And it's hamstrung efforts to deal with Syria and Iran. It also encouraged the United States to back Israel's ill-conceived assault on Lebanon. Again, this is 2006. A campaign that strengthened Hezbollah, drove Syria and Iran closer together, and further tarnished America's global image. The lobby bears considerable, though not complete, responsibility for each of these developments, and none of them was good for the United States. The bottom line is hard to escape. Although America's problems in the Middle East would not disappear if the lobby were less influential, U.S. leaders would find it easier to explore alternative approaches and be more likely to adopt policies more in line with American interests. Right? It's that piece of American interests that I want to focus on there. Right? Their complaint about U.S. backing for Israel is that they don't see it as being in American interests, right? That the U.S. should be doing things that would get the oil states on our side. The U.S. should be doing things that would get Arab states to sort of agree with the U.S. and therefore maybe be a check against Iran and Syria, and so on. And this is a very neo-realist view, right? It's not about building institutions, it's not about building relationships, right? The whole idea of Israel as democracy in the Middle East, they don't care about that, right? What they care about is American interests, and they don't see this as being in the American interest. Interestingly, the same language of American interest is used, or was used, by President Trump when he decided to move the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. What's that? Fine, but I'm saying he agreed to this, right, to this framing, right? His presidents issued these waivers on moving the embassy to Jerusalem, under the belief that delaying the recognition of Jerusalem would advance the cause of peace. Some say they lacked courage, but they made their best judgments based on facts as they understood them at the time. Nevertheless, the record is in. After more than 2 decades of waivers, we are no closer to a lasting peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. It would be folly to assume that repeating the exact same formula would now produce a different or better result. I've judged this course of action to be in the best interests of the United States of America and the pursuit of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It's that same language. And in many ways, many of the policies that President Trump has pushed for, pulling out of Syria, for example, fit very much with that neo-realist view, right? If there's not something you can accomplish in Syria that's helping American interests, well, why the heck are we there anyways? And interestingly, in slightly different language or tones, you also hear that from a lot of the Democratic candidates for president as well. That kind of question of, well, why are we in Syria? Right? The question of, okay, you don't like President Trump withdrawing from Syria, what would be your alternative? And there isn't necessarily one, right? Because there is maybe this recognition that the U.S. can't necessarily enforce its will everywhere. And that brings us to President Obama. Of course, I've gone out of order here. But the similarity between the language of American interests from the two previous sources is just so good that I wanted to stick with that. Obama, unlike liberal interventionists, this is from an article I should mention, the Atlantic Monthly from April 2016. It's a lovely 50 or so page article, if you have any interest of looking it up. But so just a couple of excerpts here. Obama, unlike liberal interventionists, is an admirer of the foreign policy realism of President George H.W. Bush, and in particular Bush's national security advisor, Brent Snowcroft. I love that guy, Obama once told me. Bush and Snowcroft removed Saddam Hussein's army from Kuwait in 1991, and I'll mention here, didn't then have the U.S. intervene when Saddam gassed the Kurds in the next year or two following. Snowcroft also, in 1991, and definitely managed the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Snowcroft also, on Bush's behalf, toasted the leaders of China shortly after the slaughter in Tiananmen Square. Obama has come...
What is the word toast here? In a glass or toasting them like toast?
No, like to your health. Right. Obama has come to a number of dovetailing conclusions about the world and America's role in it. The first, the Middle East is no longer terribly important to American interests. The second is that even if the Middle East were surpassingly important, there would still be little an American president could do to make it a better place. The third is that the innate American desire to fix the sorts of problems that manifest themselves most drastically in the Middle East inevitably leads to warfare, to the deaths of U.S. soldiers, and to the eventual hemorrhaging of U.S. credibility and power. The fourth is that the world cannot afford to see the diminishment of U.S. power. So on the one hand, I think it's very obvious that President Trump and President Obama both have very different ideas, I should say, about what it means to have U.S. power in the world, and what that U.S. power would look like. But both actually sort of push back against this sort of interventionist idea that was so popular with both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Both sort of have a lot of things that they do have more in common with George H.W. Bush in terms of foreign policy. And I think a lot of the Democratic candidates also share some of those things as well. And that means that maybe the U.S. is not going to be out there pushing as often for that sort of Western-style liberal democracy anymore. And that's also a piece of maybe this question of, well, where do we go from here? So I have 4 questions sort of to have us take away at the end of this. The first is, there's been an argument that we lived in this era of sort of Pax Americana, right? That American backing maybe helped prevent big wars in the world. That question of, well, maybe we almost went to a big war with the Soviets, so whether that's true or not is another question. But certainly in the last few decades, there's been a push for America to really sort of try and be putting out fires and to sort of be the world's policeman in a certain way. Maybe we've reached the end of that, both under President Obama and President Trump, right? Not under just one of them. And the question of, if that's true, then what happens to those bigger conflicts in the world? Is there someone who steps up? Does the UN sort of finally step up into that mandate of, hey, prevent conflicts, give permission for countries to intervene in other places? Or don't we? And does that mean that instead of maybe big conflicts, we end up with a whole bunch of little conflicts all over the world? Can the UN effectively manage conflicts? We sort of seem to have come to the answer, not really. And if the answer is not really, then okay, so where do we go from here? In other words, if the US is not, at least in theory, trying to prevent conflict, occasionally maybe starting some of them, and the UN is not in a place to prevent conflicts, then now what? And I don't know that I have an answer for that question, but I think it's an important question in that sense of, part of the goal at the end of World War I and World War II was to prevent war, right? Was looking back and saying, what just happened and how do we stop that from happening again? That some of those institutions or some of those attitudes don't seem to be out there anymore, right? And so now what? How do we deal with non-state actors? There can be great non-state actors, right? Again, there are non-state actors that do bind us together still. There are NGOs that do phenomenal work in terms of improving conditions in places. And countries occasionally can get together to create commissions or to create things that might be able to somehow tackle climate change or tackle one thing or the other. And then we also have the issue of, all of these various terrorist groups out there that don't necessarily have the goal of taking over a state as we know it. And how do you, what's that? Right, and so how do you deal with that? Right? In other words, the whole Westphalian system assumes that we're dealing with states, that states have armies, and that states have addresses, right? That if you don't keep your state in line, someone's gonna, if you don't keep your state stuff from spilling over everywhere, someone's gonna intervene. Well, what happens if your stuff spills over everywhere and there is no way to deal with it, right? Somalia is like a classic example of this, right? And we've had that example since the 1990s, right? That Somalia has not really had a full effective government for decades now. And so you get terrorist groups in Somalia, and ultimately there's no address, right? There's no one to say, hey, you better rein it in or else you might lose your power. Because nobody really, in some ways, has enough power to do that. And finally, are we starting, right, to reach this point and to reach this question of, okay, so we built this stuff, right? We've had now three different, you could argue, but two different adaptations of Westphalia, right? First, we saw the Congress of Vienna, then we saw the Treaty of Versailles, and then the United Nations after World War II, and they were both attempts at sort of solving some of those problems. But it's not clear, I mean, obviously the Congress of Vienna failed in many ways. It's not clear that the institutions set up are really equipped to deal with that problem. And so the question then of, okay, well, so then how do we deal with that problem before the next big conflict, I think comes into question as well. I really, really wish that I could leave you with this, right? I really, really wish that I could leave you with, it's the end of history, we're all heading for Western-style democracies with equality for everyone, with state responsibility for what goes on in their states, and with governments that are striving towards increasing peace in the world and towards institutions that will hopefully bind different groups together. And unfortunately, I'm sort of left with offering you sort of an America that maybe isn't in decline, but is pulling back from where it was in the world, justifiably, with a Britain that is desperately trying to figure out whether it wants to be part of this institution or not, and with a lot of tension all around in figuring out where we go. It has been a real pleasure learning with you, and thank you so much. Let me actually give you, I think you somehow got one of my photocopy sets, so you actually are lacking the last source on there if you'd like it. But yes. The two, obviously President Trump's speech is available online, and if anybody has plenty of time, that article is a fascinating read, just quite long. But it is really sort of a fascinating read into Obama's head. And includes some pretty extensive interviews.
Did the street go off yet? No.
I don't believe so.
And I'll speak to you outside.
Sure thing. Thank you very much.
So one question has been in my head. Do you see the rise of NATO as an example of the failure of the United Nations?
Do I see that? So initially it sort of was, right? In other words, initially it was an attempt to fill that. I think it's an interesting question because in some ways, part of the idea of NATO has been to keep countries together, and especially the expansion of NATO. Now, of course, the flip side of that is the expansion of NATO is part of what has brought Russia into the way that it's been acting in the last few years, right? This fear of, you've added, the Baltic states to NATO, you've added Poland to NATO, were talking at least for a while about adding Ukraine to NATO, and suddenly NATO would be basically taking all those states that used to be Soviet buffer states, or even part of the Soviet Union, and that makes Russia very nervous for obvious reasons. And so sort of the way in which those two play together, that it was an attempt at bringing those Eastern European countries into this sort of Western polity is not the right word, Western community, and has maybe turned into then a source of conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.